Callum Reed had been alone on his land for 3 years, and that's exactly how he wanted it. No neighbors dropping by, no riders passing through asking questions, no eyes watching him fumble through conversations he couldn't finish. Just him, the fields, and the work that never required him to look anyone in the eye. But that morning, when he stepped out to check the fence line near the east pasture, he saw her, a woman on horseback, sitting perfectly still about 50 yards away, watching him. She'd been there long enough that her horse had lowered its head to graze, long enough that Callum's heart had time to climb into his throat and stay there. He froze, one hand still on the fence post, the other clutching a hammer he suddenly didn't know what to do with. She wasn't from town. He knew everyone from town, even if he avoided them. This woman was different. Her posture, her clothes, the way she held the reins loose like the horse was an extension of herself. Apache, he realized, and she was staring directly at him. Not at the fence, not at the property. At him. Callum felt his face go hot. He looked down, pretended to focus on the post that didn't need fixing, and hoped she'd lose interest and ride away. But when he glanced up again, she was closer. 20 yards now, moving toward him at a walk, deliberate and unhurried. The sunlight caught the fringes on her clothing as she moved, and Callum's brain went blank except for one screaming thought that he couldn't leave, couldn't run, couldn't do anything except stand there like a fool. She stopped 10 feet away, close enough that he could see the sharpness in her eyes, the way her jaw was set like she'd already made up her mind about something, close enough that he had to look up slightly because she was still mounted, and he was on foot. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze moving from his face down to his hands and back up again. Callum felt like he was being measured for something he didn't understand. Then she spoke, her voice steady and clear. No hesitation at all. "I want a child from you." The words hit him like a physical blow. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The hammer slipped from his hand and hit the dirt with a dull thud. She didn't smile, didn't soften the statement, didn't offer an explanation, just sat there on her horse, waiting, as if she'd asked him about the weather. Callum's mind raced through 100 responses and discarded them all. This couldn't be real. Women didn't ride up to strange men and say things like that, especially not women who looked like they could break him in half without much effort. He managed to shake his head slightly, more a reflex than an answer. She tilted her head, studying his reaction with the same calm intensity. "You live alone," she said. Not a question, a statement of fact. "You don't go to town unless you have to. You work this land by yourself. No wife, no family nearby." Callum's chest tightened. How long had she been watching him? Days? Weeks? The thought made his skin crawl and something else he couldn't name. She dismounted in one smooth motion, boots hitting the ground with barely a sound. Now they were eye level, and that somehow made it worse. He could see the details now, the beadwork on her clothing, the thin scar along her jawline, the absolute certainty in her expression. She took a step closer, and Callum stepped back, his shoulder blades hitting the fence post. Trapped. She stopped, seeming to register his discomfort, but she didn't retreat. "I'm not asking you to understand right now," she said quietly. "I'm telling you what I need. You can say no. But before you do, you should know that I chose you for a reason." The way she said it, "chose you," made something twist in his stomach. Not fear exactly. Something more complicated. She reached out slowly, giving him time to flinch away if he wanted to, and touched his forearm. Just her fingertips, light as breath. Callum forgot how to breathe entirely. Her skin was warm against his, and her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him feel like he was the only person in the world. Or maybe like he was finally visible after years of trying to disappear. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said, her hand dropping away. "Think about it." She turned and mounted her horse in one fluid movement, and Callum still hadn't managed to form a single word. As she rode away, he realized he didn't even know her name, and he realized something else, something that terrified him more than anything that had just happened. Part of him, some buried part he didn't recognize, wanted her to come back. Callum didn't sleep that night. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling beams, replaying every second of the encounter until the words lost meaning and became just sounds in his head. "I want a child from you." The audacity of it. The impossibility. The fact that she'd said it with the same tone someone might use to discuss the price of grain. He rolled onto his side, then his back again, then gave up entirely and sat at the small table near the window. Through the glass he could see nothing but darkness, and his own pale reflection staring back. A stranger's face. He barely recognized himself these days. 3 years of isolation had turned him into something he didn't have a name for. Not quite a hermit, not quite alive either, just existing in the space between, doing the work because the work needed doing, eating because his body demanded it, sleeping because eventually exhaustion won. He'd convinced himself he was content, that this was enough, that needing nothing from anyone was the same as being strong. Then she'd appeared and shattered that lie with 6 words. By the time dawn broke, Callum had made his decision. He would tell her no, politely if he could manage it, but firmly. He didn't know her. She didn't know him. Whatever reason she thought she had for choosing him, she was wrong. He was nobody's choice. Never had been. He went through his morning routine with mechanical precision, fed the chickens, checked the horses in the corral, hauled water from the well. Normal things. Grounding things. Things that proved the world still made sense even if yesterday had felt like fever dream. But when he looked toward the east pasture, his hands went still on the bucket handle. She was there again. Same spot as yesterday. Horse grazing peacefully while she sat motionless in the saddle, watching, waiting. Callum's carefully prepared speech evaporated. His resolve crumbled. He set the bucket down and wiped his palms on his pants, a nervous habit he hated, and started walking toward her before he could talk himself out of it. She didn't move as he approached. Didn't dismount. Just watched him close the distance between them with that same unreadable expression. When he was close enough to speak without shouting, he stopped, opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "I don't even know your name," he managed. His voice came out rougher than intended. "Kiona," she said simply. The name felt foreign in his ears, sharp and unfamiliar. He nodded, filing it away, and tried to remember what he'd planned to say. All those hours of mental preparation, and now his mind was blank except for the awareness of her eyes on him. Why me? The question came out before he could stop it. Not the refusal he'd practiced, just the raw confusion that had kept him awake all night. Kiona tilted her head slightly, considering him. For a long moment she said nothing, and Callum felt the weight of her assessment like a physical thing. Then she dismounted, slow and deliberate, and took a step closer. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that he could see the details. The way the morning light caught in her dark eyes. The set of her jaw that suggested she'd faced harder questions than this, and survived them. "I watched you for 5 days, she said quietly. "I saw how you treat your animals. Gentle hands. Patient. You fixed the fence instead of cursing it. You carried water to the wild horses that come to your property line, even though they're not yours. You work hard, but you don't work angry." She paused, and something flickered across her face. Vulnerability, maybe, or pain. Most men I've known work angry. They take what the land gives and demand more. You ask, you wait, you respect what you can't control. Callum's throat tightened. Nobody had ever watched him that closely. Nobody had ever cared to. "My people are scattered," Kiona continued, her voice lower now. "Fewer every season. The old ways are dying because there aren't enough of us to remember them. I need a child who will carry what I know. But I won't bring that child into violence or cruelty." Her eyes locked onto his. "I need someone who understands that strength isn't always loud." The words settled into Callum's chest like stones. Heavy. Undeniable. He wanted to argue that she had the wrong person, that he wasn't strong at all, that his gentleness was just another word for weakness. But the way she looked at him made those protests feel like lies. "I can't," he started, but the words died when he saw movement on the ridge beyond her shoulder. 3 riders. Coming fast. Kiona followed his gaze and her entire body went rigid. The riders weren't colonists. Callum could tell by the way they sat their horses, the way they moved across the land like they were part of it rather than conquering it. Apache, like Kiona. But where she carried herself with controlled purpose, these 3 radiated something harder. Anger, maybe, or judgment. Kiona's hand moved to her horse's neck, a gesture that seemed more about steadying herself than the animal. Her jaw tightened, and for the first time since Callum had met her, he saw something that looked like fear flicker across her face. Not fear of the riders themselves. Fear of what they represented. The 3 pulled up about 20 feet away, forming a loose semicircle that put Callum and Kiona at the center of their attention. 2 men and a woman, all older than Kiona by at least a decade. The woman spoke first, her words sharp and rapid in a language Callum didn't understand. He caught the tone, though. Accusation. Disappointment. Kiona responded in the same language, her voice level but firm. The exchange went back and forth, escalating with each sentence. The older woman gestured toward Callum with clear disdain, and he felt his face go hot, even though he had no idea what was being said. One of the men, gray-haired and weathered, leaned forward in his saddle and said something that made Kiona's shoulders stiffen. She snapped a response that silenced him, but the damage was done. The air felt charged, dangerous. Callum stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to run back to his house and lock the door. But something kept him rooted. Maybe it was the way Kiona had positioned herself slightly in front of him, like she was shielding him from something he couldn't see. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he mattered to someone, even if that someone was a stranger who'd shown up yesterday with an impossible request. The older woman dismounted and walked straight up to Kiona, their faces inches apart. She spoke in a low, controlled tone that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. Kiona didn't back down, didn't flinch, just held her ground and responded with equal intensity. Then the woman's eyes slid to Callum, and he felt dissected under that gaze. Evaluated and found wanting. She said something to Kiona without breaking eye contact with him, and whatever it was made Kiona's hands curl into fists at her sides. "Enough," Kiona said in English, loud enough that everyone understood. The shift in language felt deliberate, a line drawn. "This is my choice. Mine, not yours, not the council's. Mine." The older woman's expression hardened, but she switched to English as well, her accent thick but clear. "Your choice affects all of us, Kiona. You think you can bring a child into this world without consequences? Without approval? He is weak." She gestured at Callum with contempt. "Look at him. He can barely stand under your attention, let alone stand beside you when the hard seasons come." Callum felt the words like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Or at least, they matched everything he believed about himself. But then Kiona stepped forward, putting herself fully between him and the older woman. "You're wrong," Kiona said quietly, dangerously. "Strength isn't only what you can see. He has something the loud men never had. He has respect, patience, the ability to listen." She paused, and her next words carried weight that made even the older woman hesitate. "He has what my father had, what we lost when we stopped valuing quiet courage." The silence that followed felt enormous. The older woman stared at Kiona like she'd been struck, and something shifted in her expression. Not acceptance, but recognition. Painful recognition. One of the men spoke then, his voice gentler than before, trying to bridge the gap. Kiona shook her head, responding in their language again, and Callum caught the exhaustion in her posture, the weight of whatever argument she was making. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the older woman stepped back. She said something short and final, then mounted her horse. The 3 riders turned and headed back the way they'd come, leaving dust and tension in their wake. Kiona stood there watching them disappear over the ridge, her shoulders rising and falling with deep breaths. Callum wanted to ask what had just happened, what had been said, what it meant. But when she finally turned to face him, the vulnerability in her eyes stopped every question cold. "They think I'm making a mistake," she said quietly. "They think you'll fail me when it matters." Callum swallowed hard. Maybe they're right. Kiona moved closer, and this time when she reached out, her hand found his, palm to palm, warm and solid and impossible to ignore. "Then prove them wrong. Prove them wrong." The words echoed in Callum's head for the rest of that day and all through the next morning. He didn't know how to prove anything to anyone, much less to people who'd already decided he wasn't worth their respect. But Kiona returned the following afternoon, and this time she didn't wait at the property line. She rode straight to his small house and dismounted like she'd done it 100 times before, like she belonged there. Callum was repairing the door hinge when he heard the hoofbeats, and his hands went still on the screwdriver. She approached slowly, reading his hesitation, and stopped a few feet away. "I need to know you can survive," she said without preamble. "Not just work the land, survive when things go wrong." Callum frowned, not understanding. Kiona gestured toward the horizon, where dark clouds were gathering in a way that made his stomach drop. He'd lived here long enough to recognize that particular shade of gray. "Storm coming. A bad one." "Your roof," Kiona said, looking up at the weathered shingles. "Half those boards are rotted through. When the rain comes, it won't hold. She was right. Callum had been meaning to fix it for months, but the task felt overwhelming when faced alone. Now, with the storm maybe hours away, it felt impossible. "I'll manage," he said, the lie obvious even to himself. Kiona didn't argue. She just started walking toward the small shed where he kept his tools and ladder. Before Callum could process what was happening, she'd hauled the ladder out and propped it against the side of the house. She looked at him, waiting, not offering to do it for him, just waiting to see if he'd act. Callum's pride warred with his fear of heights, his embarrassment at needing help, his certainty that he'd mess it up somehow. But the way Kiona stood there, patient and expectant, made something shift in his chest. He grabbed the spare boards he'd been hoarding and climbed the ladder before he could talk himself out of it. His hands shook on the first few rungs, but he forced himself higher. The wind was already picking up, making the ladder sway slightly. Callum's breath came short, but he kept going. At the top he could see the damage clearly. 3 boards completely rotted, 2 more cracked beyond repair. He'd need to move fast. He started pulling nails, working with more urgency than skill, and nearly lost his balance when a gust of wind hit. Kiona steadied the ladder from below without a word, her presence grounding him even when the height made his head spin. Board by board, he replaced what was broken. His shoulders burned, sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cooling air. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not with Kiona watching. Not with her people's judgment hanging over both of them. The first drops of rain hit just as he hammered the last nail home. He climbed down fast, nearly stumbling on the bottom rung, and Kiona caught his arm to steady him. They stood there, both breathing hard, as the rain began in earnest. Within seconds it was a downpour. Kiona pulled him toward the house, and they barely made it inside before the sky opened completely. Through the window, they watched the storm unleash itself. Lightning split the sky. Thunder shook the walls. But the roof held. Water didn't pour through the ceiling. The house stayed dry. Callum realized he was still shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline and something that felt uncomfortably close to pride. He'd done it. Not perfectly, but enough. Kiona stood beside him, water dripping from her hair, her clothes soaked through. She should have looked diminished, uncomfortable. Instead, she looked at him with something that might have been approval. "You were afraid," she said quietly. Callum nodded, not trusting his voice. "But you climbed anyway." She turned to face him fully, and her next words carried weight. "That's what I needed to see. Not that you're fearless. That you act despite the fear." Before Callum could respond, she stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her despite the wet clothes. Her hand came up slowly, giving him time to pull away, and rested against his chest, right over his racing heart. She could feel it hammering there, proof of his terror and his effort. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he didn't look away. Couldn't look away. The storm raged outside, but inside, something else was building. Something that scared him more than any height ever could. The storm lasted through the night. Kiona stayed, not because Callum asked, but because leaving in that weather would have been foolish. They sat on opposite sides of the small room, the fire between them doing more to fill the silence than any words could. Callum kept glancing at her, trying to reconcile the warrior who'd faced down her own people with the woman now sitting cross-legged on his floor, methodically braiding and unbraiding a section of her hair. A nervous habit, maybe. Proof she was human after all. Sometime past midnight, she spoke. "I have until the next full moon." Callum looked up from the mug of water he'd been staring into. For what? To make my choice final. To conceive, or to accept the match my people arranged. Her voice stayed level, but her hands stilled on her hair. "There's a man from another group. Strong fighter. Good hunter. Everything they think I should want. But you don't want him," Callum said. Not a question. Kiona's jaw tightened. "He's like the others. Loud, quick to anger. He sees women as things to be protected or possessed. Never as equals." She looked directly at Callum then, and vulnerability cracked through her composure. "My mother was matched with a man like that. He was a good provider, respected by everyone. But he broke her spirit slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but obedience. When she passed, people said it was fever. But I know better. She just stopped fighting to stay alive." The words hung heavy in the air. Callum felt them settle into his chest, understanding dawning. This wasn't just about preserving culture or having a child. This was about survival. about choosing a different path than the one that had destroyed her mother. "I won't be that kind of man," he said quietly. Then, realizing how presumptuous that sounded, added, "I mean, I couldn't be if I tried. I'm barely enough man as it is." Kiona moved then, crossing the space between them and kneeling in front of him. Her hands came up to frame his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Stop saying that. Stop believing what they told you." Her voice was fierce. "You think strength is volume and violence, but the strongest person I ever knew was my grandmother. She survived things that would have broken those loud men. She endured because she was flexible like grass, not rigid like dead wood. You have that same quality. You bend, you adapt, you survive." Callum's throat tightened. Nobody had ever spoken to him like this, like he mattered, like his gentleness wasn't a defect. "I'm terrified," he admitted, "of all of this, of you, of failing you." "Good," Kiona said, and something like a smile touched her lips. "Fear means you understand what's at stake. Only fools feel no fear." Her thumbs brushed along his cheekbones, a gesture so tender it made his chest ache. "I'm terrified too. Terrified I'm wrong about you. Terrified I'm right but it won't matter, because my people will force my hand anyway. Terrified that even if we do this, I won't know how to be anything but what my mother's life taught me to fear." The honesty in her words cracked something open in Callum. He reached up slowly, covering her hands with his own. They stayed like that, foreheads nearly touching, breathing the same air. Outside, the storm began to ease. Dawn wasn't far off, and with it, decisions that couldn't be unmade. Kiona pulled back slightly, searching his face. "The full moon is in 6 days," she said quietly. "I need your answer, Callum. Not tomorrow. Not in 5 days. Now. Because if you say no, I need time to prepare for the other path. And if you say yes..." She paused, and he saw fear flash through her eyes. "If you say yes, we don't have time to waste." Callum's heart hammered against his ribs. 6 days. Less than a week to decide something that would change both their lives forever. Every rational part of his brain screamed that this was insane. He barely knew her. She barely knew him. This wasn't how things were supposed to happen. But then he thought about the way she'd watched him fix the roof, the way she'd steadied the ladder, the way she'd defended him to her people, the way she saw strength in him when no one else ever had. He thought about 3 years of isolation and the slow death that came with it. He thought about his mother's voice, years ago, telling him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act anyway. He thought about Kiona's mother, spirit broken piece by piece, and knew with sudden clarity that he'd rather fail trying than never try at all. "Yes," he said, then stronger. "Yes." Kiona's eyes widened, like she'd expected anything but that answer. Relief and fear crossed her face in equal measure. She opened her mouth to respond, but whatever she was going to say was cut off by the sound of horses outside. Multiple horses, coming fast even though the ground was still slick with rain. Kiona was on her feet before Callum could move, her entire body tense and ready. Through the window, he could see 4 riders approaching through the early morning mist. Not the same 3 from before. These were different, younger, and the man in front sat his horse like he owned the world beneath it. Kiona's face went pale in a way Callum hadn't seen before. Real fear. Not for herself, but for what was coming. "That's him," she said quietly. "Dakota. The man they chose for me." Callum's stomach dropped. He moved toward the window, studying the approaching group. Dakota was everything Callum wasn't. Broad-shouldered, confident, moving with the kind of physical certainty that came from never doubting your place in the world. The kind of man people followed naturally. The kind of man who could take what he wanted and call it strength. "Stay inside," Kiona said, heading for the door. "No." The word came out before Callum could think about it. Kiona turned, surprise flickering across her face. "If I hide now, I prove them right. I prove I'm not strong enough." Something shifted in Kiona's expression. Not quite pride, but close. She nodded once, sharp and definitive, and they walked out together. Dakota pulled his horse to a stop 15 feet away. Up close, he was even more imposing. Scars on his arms suggested countless fights survived. His eyes were hard, assessing, dismissive when they landed on Callum. He spoke in his language, directing his words at Kiona, but his gaze never left Callum. The contempt was universal. Needed no translation. Kiona responded, her voice steady, but her hands clenched at her sides. The exchange grew heated quickly. Dakota gestured at Callum with open disgust, said something that made his companions laugh. One of them, a younger man with a cruel smile, added his own comment, and the laughter grew louder. Callum felt heat rise in his face. Not anger exactly. Something worse. Shame. The old familiar shame of being found lacking, of being the joke everyone shared. But then he felt Kiona's hand find his, her fingers threading through his with deliberate intention. A statement. A choice made visible. Dakota's expression darkened. He dismounted in one fluid motion and walked toward them, each step radiating controlled aggression. He stopped directly in front of Callum, close enough that Callum had to tilt his head back slightly to maintain eye contact. The height difference felt enormous, symbolic. "You think you can have her?" Dakota said in heavily accented English. His voice was low, dangerous. "You think your soft hands and scared eyes are enough?" Callum's throat tightened, but he didn't step back, didn't let go of Kiona's hand. "I think she gets to choose." Dakota's laugh was harsh. "She chooses weakness. She chooses shame for her people. She chooses a man who will get her hurt when enemies come." He leaned closer, and Callum could smell sweat and leather and something sharper. "Threat. I could break you without effort. We both know this." "Probably," Callum said, and his voice shook but held. "But breaking people isn't the same as being strong, and it's not what she needs." The words seemed to surprise Dakota more than defiance would have. He straightened slightly, reassessing. Then his hand shot out fast, gripping Callum's shirt, pulling him forward off balance. Kiona moved to intervene, but Dakota's free hand came up in a stopping gesture. Not to her, to his own men who'd started forward. This was between him and Callum now. "You want to prove you're worthy," Dakota said quietly. "Then don't flinch." His fist came up, pulled back, ready to strike. Callum could see it coming, had time to duck or pull away or raise his hands to defend himself. Every instinct screamed to move, but he understood this test. Understood that flinching would prove everything Dakota believed about him. So he stood there, heart hammering, and kept his eyes open, kept his gaze locked on Dakota's. Didn't move. The fist stopped an inch from his face, held there, trembling slightly with restrained force. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then Dakota lowered his hand and released Callum's shirt with a sharp push that made him stumble back a step. The contempt in Dakota's eyes had shifted into something else. Not respect exactly, but recognition. He turned to Kiona and spoke rapidly in their language. Whatever he said made her straighten, made her grip on Callum's hand tighten almost painfully. Dakota looked at Callum one more time, said something that sounded like a warning, then mounted his horse. His companions followed suit, clearly confused, but obedient. As they rode away, Callum realized he was shaking. His legs felt weak, his breath coming in short gasps. Kiona pulled him back toward the house, and once inside, he had to sit down before he fell down. She knelt in front of him, hands on his knees, eyes searching his face with intensity. "You didn't flinch," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "He pulled his fist back and you didn't flinch." "I was too scared to move," Callum admitted. Kiona shook her head. "No, fear would make you duck, make you protect yourself. You chose to stand still. That's different." She paused, and tears he didn't expect gathered in her eyes. "My father did that once. Stood before a charging horse to save a child. Everyone said he was brave, but he told me later he was terrified. Just chose not to run." Her hands tightened on his knees. "That's what Dakota saw. That's why he left. You have what he doesn't. The courage to be afraid and stand anyway." Callum wanted to say something, but his voice wouldn't work. So he just pulled her closer, and she came willingly, her head resting against his chest where she could feel his racing heart finally begin to slow. After Dakota left, the world felt different, quieter, like something that had been pressing down on both of them had finally lifted. Callum and Kiona stood outside his house for a long time, neither speaking, just processing what had happened, what it meant. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, and eventually Kiona turned to him. 2 days left, she said quietly, until the full moon. 2 days, 48 hours to be certain about something that would change everything. Callum looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something fundamental had shifted inside him. The fear was still there, would probably always be there in some measure, but it no longer controlled him. Kiona had seen him at his most terrified and hadn't turned away. She'd seen him refuse to flinch when a fist came at his face, seen him shake afterward, and called it courage anyway. Maybe she was right. Maybe courage wasn't the absence of fear. Maybe it was just the choice to stand steady when everything in you screamed to run. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I don't need 2 more days," he said. "I needed to know I could stand beside you when it mattered, that I wouldn't fail you when you needed strength." He paused, squeezing her hand. "Dakota tested me. Your people tested me. I tested myself. And I'm still here, still choosing you, still certain." Kiona's eyes glistened, and she stepped closer, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, where his heart still beat hard and fast. "You're certain," she repeated like she needed to hear him say it again. "Completely." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for doubt or hesitation. When she found none, something in her expression cracked open. Relief, fear, joy, all tangled together. "Then we don't wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The moon is close enough. My body is ready. And more importantly," she pressed her palm flat against his heartbeat. "We're ready. Both of us." Callum nodded, not trusting his voice. Kiona took his hand and led him toward the house. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at the prairie stretching endlessly around them. The land that had witnessed her choice, his transformation, their impossible decision to build something new from 2 different worlds. Then she looked at him, and her expression held nothing but certainty. "Once we do this, there's no going back," she said. "You understand that? My people don't recognize separation or divorce. Once bound, always bound. Even if it becomes difficult. Even if we discover we were wrong about each other." "I know," Callum said, "and I'm not wrong about you. You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You made me braver without changing who I am. That's not luck. That's not a mistake. That's exactly right." Kiona's breath caught, and tears spilled over. She pulled him close, kissing him with an intensity that made his head spin. Not gentle this time. Urgent, necessary, a promise sealed with desperate certainty. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she pressed her forehead to his. "My grandmother used to say that the strongest bonds are forged in fire," she whispered. "That easy love doesn't last, but love that survives doubt. Fear and opposition becomes unbreakable." Her hands framed his face. "We've had the fire, Callum. Now we get to find out if we're unbreakable." He kissed her again, softer this time, and led her inside. The door closed behind them, shutting out the watching world, the judging eyes, the impossible expectations. Inside, it was just 2 people who'd chosen each other against all logic. 2 people who'd decided that courage mattered more than certainty. 2 people building a bridge between worlds that had been separated for too long. The afternoon light filtered through the small window, casting everything in warm gold. Outside, birds called to each other. The wind moved through the grass. Life continued, indifferent to the magnitude of what was happening within those wooden walls. But for Callum and Kiona, nothing would ever be the same. They were choosing permanence, choosing partnership, choosing a future that terrified them both and felt more right than anything either had known before. Hours later, as the sun began its descent and the sky shifted toward evening, they lay together in the quiet aftermath of choice made real. Kiona's head rested on Callum's chest, her hand tracing idle patterns on his skin. His arm wrapped around her shoulders, holding her close like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. "No regrets?" she asked quietly. Callum looked down at her, at the woman who'd ridden into his life and demanded he be braver than he thought possible, at the woman who would carry his child, at the future he'd been too afraid to imagine until she forced him to see it. "None," he said, and meant it with everything he had. 6 weeks later, the older woman from the Apache Council returned. Callum saw her approaching from the East Ridge and felt his stomach tighten. But this time Kiona stood beside him, her hand resting on her still flat belly in a gesture that had become habit. They'd known for 2 weeks. The signs were subtle but certain, confirmed by Kiona's knowledge of her own body and the changes she recognized. The older woman dismounted slowly, and Callum noticed she came alone this time. No escort, no show of force. Just one elder approaching 2 people who'd made a choice she hadn't approved. She stopped a respectful distance away and studied them both. Her gaze lingered on Kiona's protective hand placement, and something shifted in her weathered face. Not quite approval, but acknowledgement. "The council has debated for many days," she said in careful English, directing her words to both of them now. "Not just Kiona. Some said your choice was rebellion. Others said it was foolishness. Dakota's father demanded we force you to honor the arrangement. Callum felt Kiona tense beside him, but she didn't speak. Neither did he. They just waited. But Dakota himself spoke against his father. The older woman continued. He told the council that he saw something in this man. Not the strength he would have chosen, but strength nonetheless. He said forcing a woman to accept a man she doesn't respect would only repeat the mistakes that killed our daughter's spirits. She paused, and pain flickered across her face. He said his own mother lived that way, obedient but dead inside. He won't continue that pattern. The admission hung in the air, heavy with generations of unspoken suffering. Callum understood then that this was bigger than just him and Kiona. This was about changing something that had been broken for a long time. The council has decided to honor your choice, the older woman said quietly. The child will be recognized as part of our people. But there are conditions. Kiona's hand tightened on Callum's. What conditions? You must teach the child our ways, our language, our stories. And you, she looked directly at Callum now, must learn them too. You cannot raise one of our children if you remain ignorant of who we are. Callum nodded immediately. I'll learn, whatever it takes. The older woman's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Kiona's grandmother said the same thing about your people when she married outside our group. She learned your language, your customs. She built bridges instead of walls. She paused. My sister, your grandmother, she said to Kiona, and the revelation made Kiona's breath catch. I watched her choose love over tradition, and I was angry. I thought she was abandoning us, but she raised children who understood both worlds. Who could walk between them? Her eyes glistened. Maybe I was wrong to forget that lesson. The words settled over them like benediction. The older woman reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small beaded bracelet. She approached slowly and handed it to Kiona. This belonged to your grandmother. She would want you to have it now, to remember that courage runs in your blood. Kiona took the bracelet with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. The older woman touched her shoulder briefly, then turned to Callum. She looked at him for a long moment, really seeing him this time, not just measuring him against what she expected strength to look like. Protect her spirit, she said quietly, not just her body. That's what my sister's husband did. That's why she lived with joy instead of just survival. I will, Callum promised, and meant it with everything he had. The older woman nodded once, mounted her horse and rode away. As she disappeared over the ridge, Callum felt Kiona lean into him, her weight familiar and grounding now. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her while she cried tears that seemed part grief, part relief, part joy. You did it, she whispered when she could speak again. You proved them all wrong, proved I was right to choose you. Callum looked down at her, at the woman who'd ridden into his life and demanded he be braver than he thought possible, at the woman carrying his child, at the future he'd been too afraid to imagine until she forced him to see it. We did it, he corrected gently. You chose me when I couldn't choose myself. You saw strength I didn't know I had. He touched her face, wiping away tears with his thumb. Everything I am now, everything I'm going to be for you and for our child, started the day you rode up to my fence and asked the impossible. Kiona smiled through her tears, that rare full smile that still made his heart stop. She took his hand and placed it over her belly, over the life they'd created together, over the future they'd fought for, over the bridge they'd built between two different worlds. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but Callum didn't fear them anymore. He'd learned that storms passed, that roofs could be repaired, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to stand steady when everything in you wanted to run. He'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let someone see you, really see you, and choose you anyway. The man who'd lived alone for 3 years, terrified of connection, no longer existed. In his place stood someone new, still afraid sometimes, still uncertain, but no longer paralyzed by it, no longer alone. Kiona leaned up and kissed him softly, a promise and a thank you all at once. When she pulled back, her eyes held nothing but certainty. Come on, she said, tugging his hand toward the house. We have a lot to prepare, and you have a language to start learning. Callum followed her, smiling, ready for whatever came next. Together they walked toward the home they'd built from impossible choices and quiet courage, toward a future that had started with 6 words that changed everything. I want a child from you. And he'd said yes. If you enjoyed this story, Click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.